For 20 years, the Alpha King of Thornwood kept one room locked, guarding a secret he swore to take to his grave. He was a ruler built of iron and silence. But his frozen world shattered the day a shivering orphan girl arrived at his gates. She didn't beg for gold or pity. She simply stared at the hidden masterpiece in his hall, turned to the most dangerous man in the realm, and asked the one question that could finally break him. "Why is my mother's portrait in your castle?" The iron gate of Thornwood Keep rose against the gray October sky like the ribcage of some great sleeping beast, and the girl standing before it looked very small indeed. Hannah clutched her mother's old shawl to her chest, the wool worn thin in places, the color faded from blue to a soft, uncertain gray. She had been walking for 3 days, sleeping in haylofts and under hedges, eating bread given by kind strangers who asked too many questions. A wagon driver had brought her the last mile, pointing at the distant towers and saying, "They say the Alpha King takes in orphans, sometimes. If you've nowhere else to go, lass, that's your best chance." She had nowhere else to go. The guard at the gate was a broad-shouldered man with a scarred chin and a voice like gravel. He looked down at her, then at the shawl, then at her thin blue dress, and something in his face softened, though he tried not to show it. "State your business, child," he said. Hannah swallowed. Her throat was dry. "They said," she began, then stopped. The words felt too heavy. "They said there's someone here who knows who I am." The guard frowned. "Who are you, then?" "My name is Hannah," she hesitated. "My mother was Margaret. She died last month. She told me to come here. She said the Alpha King would know what to do with me." The guard's frown deepened. He exchanged a look with the second guard, a younger man with a thin mustache, who shrugged. "Wait here," the first guard said, and disappeared through a small door beside the gate. Hannah waited. The wind picked up, tugging at her skirt, and she pulled the shawl tighter. The castle loomed above her, gray stone against gray sky, and she tried not to feel afraid. Her mother had said, "He will take care of you, Hannah. He is a hard man, but he keeps high thinks, Swed." She had said it with a strange look in her eyes, a look Hannah had not understood at the time. She understood it even less now. The guard returned after what felt like a long time. His face was different when he came back, less gruff, more unsettled. He opened the gate and gestured for her to come through. "The Alpha King has agreed to see you housed," he said carefully. "For now, you'll be taken to the East Wing. Mistress Eleanor will see to your needs." Hannah stepped through the gate. The courtyard was vast, cobbled and swept clean, with a great stone fountain in the center that had long since been drained for the season. Servants moved across the yard with baskets and buckets, and a few of them glanced at her, curious before looking away. The guard led her up a set of wide stone steps and through a heavy oak door into the keep itself. The warmth hit her immediately, and she realized how cold she had been. The great hall was lit by iron sconces, their flames casting long shadows on the tapestries that hung from the walls. A massive fireplace stood at the far end, big enough to roast an ox, and the fire within it crackled with a warmth that seemed to reach for her. But it was not the fire that caught her eye. It was a portrait, hanging above the mantel, half shrouded in shadow. She stopped walking. The guard stopped too, turning to look at her. "Child?" Hannah did not answer. She was staring at the portrait, a woman with dark hair and gray eyes holding a small bouquet of thorn flowers, a faint smile on her lips. The woman looked young, perhaps 20, and her face was... Hannah's breath caught. The woman in the portrait looked like her mother. The guard cleared his throat. "Mistress Eleanor is waiting, child. Come along." Hannah forced her legs to move. She feminily lead. Did he go the guard through a corridor and up a narrow flight of stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to ask about the portrait, but the words would not come. Perhaps she had imagined it. The light had been dim, and she was tired, and her mother was dead, and dead people did not hang in the castles of strange lords. But the face had been so familiar. The East Wing was quieter than the great hall, the corridors narrower, the tapestries older. The guard stopped at a heavy wooden door and knocked. A moment later the door opened, and a woman with a round face and sharp gray eyes peered out. "This is the girl," the guard said. "Mistress Eleanor, the Alpha King's orders." Eleanor looked at Hannah, then at the shawl, then at the thin blue dress. Her expression was unreadable. "Come in, child," she said. "You must be half frozen." The room beyond the door was small but warm, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small fireplace in which a fire already burned. A tray of bread and cheese sat on a table by the window, and a pitcher of water beside it. Hannah stood in the middle of the room, clutching her shawl, unsure what to do. Eleanor closed the door behind her and motioned to the bed. "Sit, eat. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days." Hannah sat on the edge of the bed. She did not reach for the bread. "Mistress Eleanor," she said quietly, "who is the woman in the portrait in the great hall?" Eleanor's hands, which had been moving toward the tray, paused. She straightened slowly and looked at Hannah with an expression that was difficult to read. "That," she said, "is a question better asked of the Alpha King himself." "Will I meet him?" Eleanor's mouth tightened. "In time, child, in time. For now, eat your bread and rest. You've had a long journey, and the bind will be cold." Hannah did not press further. She took a piece of bread and bit into it, though she barely tasted it. Her mind was full of the portrait, and the woman who looked like her mother, and the strange heavy silence that seemed to hang over the entire castle. That night, after Eleanor had left and the candles had burned low, Hannah lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. The fire had died to embers, and the room was dark, but she could still see the portrait in her mind's eye, the dark hair, the gray eyes, the thorn flowers. She had seen those flowers before. Her mother had kept a dried sprig of them in a small wooden box, and when Hannah had asked why, her mother had said only, "They are from a place I loved, long ago." Hannah closed her eyes and pressed her mother's shawl to her cheek. It smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke, the only things left of her mother's presence. "I am all right," she whispered into the dark. "I am all right." She did not believe it. In the tower above, Nathaniel of House Thornwood stood at a narrow window, looking down at the courtyard. The girl's arrival had been announced to him an hour ago, and he had watched her from the shadows as she crossed the stones, small, thin, so much like her mother that it had struck him like a blow to the chest. He had not gone down to greet her. He had not been able to. In his hand he held a letter, worn at the folds. The ink faded but still legible. It was dated 12 years ago, and it was the last letter Margaret had ever written to him. "Dear Nathaniel," it read, "if you are reading this, I am gone. I have a daughter. Her name is Hannah. She has my eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she is the only good thing I have left in this world. I am asking you, not as a lord, but as think fine. I once knew, to take care of her when I cannot. I know I have no right to ask. I know I have no claim on you. But she is innocent, and she is alone, and I have no one else to turn to. Please, if there is any kindness left in your heart, any memory of what we once were, please take care of my girl." Nathaniel read the letter again, though he knew it by heart. He had read it 100 times since it arrived by messenger 3 weeks ago. He folded it carefully and placed it back in the drawer of his desk. The girl was here, Margaret's daughter. His hands trembled, and he pressed them flat against the cold stone of the windowsill. He did not know how to face her. He did not know how to look into those gray eyes, Margaret's eyes, and tell her the truth, that he had loved her mother once, that he had failed her, that he had spent 20 years carrying a guilt so heavy it had turned his heart to stone. But he had given his word, and Nathaniel of House Thornwood had never broken a promise. He turned from the window and walked slowly to his chair by the fire. The flames danced, casting shadows on the walls, and he sat there for a long time, alone with the weight of the past. In the east wing the girl slept, her mother's shawl clutched in her arms, and in the tower above the Alpha King kept his vigil, silent, unmoving, waiting for the dawn. The first light of autumn crept through the narrow window of the east wing, pale and thin, like watered milk. Hannah woke to the sound of a rooster somewhere far below, and for a moment she did not know where she was. The ceiling above her was stone, not the cracked wooden beams of the cottage. The blanket was heavy wool, not the thin quilt her mother had stitched from old flour sacks. Then she remembered. Her mother was gone. And this was the castle of the Alpha King. She sat up slowly, clutching the shawl to her chest. The old blue dress lay folded on the chair beside the bed, clean but faded, the color of a sky that had given up its blue. Someone had washed it during the night. She had not heard them come in. The thought made her feel strange, both grateful and exposed, as if a stranger had seen her sleeping. There was a knock at the door, gentle but firm. "Child," came the voice of Mistress Eleanor. "The porridge is hot, and I will not have it go cold while you sit staring at the walls." Hannah dressed quickly, her fingers clumsy with the laces. When she opened the door, the housekeeper stood in the corridor with a brass keyring at her belt and a face like a winter apple, wrinkled and tart but with something warm beneath the skin. "This way," Eleanor said, and set off down the corridor without waiting. The kitchen was vast and low-ceilinged, thick with the smell of wood smoke and bread. A fire roared in the great hearth, and a pot of porridge bubbled over the flames. Eleanor ladled out a bowl, set it before Hannah, and placed a small honey cake beside it, still warm, glistening. "Eat," she said. "And mind your manners, child. But eat first." Hannah took a spoonful. The porridge was sweet, richer than anything her mother had been able to afford in the last years. She ate in silence, and Eleanor busied herself at the counter, pretending not to watch. "The castle is very big," Hannah said quietly between bites. "Aye, that it is. Too big for one man and a handful of servants, but it has stood for 300 years, and it will stand for 300 more, with or without my approval." "Does the Alpha King live here alone?" Eleanor paused, her hands dusted with flour rested on the counter. "He lives to her."
Just think, quote, tailing EE. She said carefully. Alone enough. Hannah wanted to ask more, about the portrait, about the woman with the thorn flowers, about why her own mother's face hung in a stranger's hall. But something in Eleanor's tone told her the questions would not be welcome. So she lowered her eyes and finished her porridge. The sky outside the kitchen window was a pale gray, the clouds low and heavy. Rain had fallen overnight, and the cobbled yard was slick with it. Eleanor led her through a narrow passage and out into the stable yard where the air smelled of wet hay and horse. "Old Bram," Eleanor called. "The girl needs air. Show her the horses and keep her out of the mud." A wiry old man emerged from the stable door, wiping his hands on a rag. His face was a map of creases, his beard gray as ash, and his eyes were the pale blue of a winter sky. He looked Hannah over, then nodded once. "Aye, I can do that. Come along, lass. Mind the puddles, they bite harder than they look." He led her into the stable, which was warm and dark and smelled of straw and leather. Along the stalls, horses turned their heads, curious, their breath steaming in the cold air. At the far end, in the largest stall, stood a great white horse, old and broad, with a mane like silver silk. "That one's Storm," old Bram said, leaning on the stall door. "Don't let the name fool you. He's the gentlest beast in the whole of Thornwood, and the oldest. He and I, we've seen the seasons turn together, and we both creak in the mornings." Hannah stepped closer. The horse lowered his head, nostrils flaring, and huffed a warm breath against her shoulder. She reached up slowly and touched his mane. He did not flinch. "He likes you," old Bram said, a note of surprise in his voice. "He's particular, that one. Won't let just any thing near him." Hannah stroked the old horse's neck, feeling the warmth of him through her fingers. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "Aye, he is. And he remembers more than he lets on. This castle's stones remember everything, lass. Every footstep, every whisper, every promise made and broken. If they could talk, they'd tell you the whole story of Thornwood." Hannah looked up at him. "What story?" Old Bram's eyes flickered, and for a moment he seemed about to say something, but then he shook his head and patted the horse's flank. "Ah, that's for another day. The stones keep their secrets. And so do I. Come, let me show you the rest of the stable." They spent the morning together, the old man and the girl. He showed her the young mare with the white star on her forehead, the stubborn mule who refused to work on Thursdays, and a small brown pony with a crooked ear that he said was useless as a gate without hinges, but loyal as sunrise. Hannah laughed, a small, rusty sound, as if she had forgotten how, and old Bram grinned, showing a gap where a tooth should have been. By midday, the clouds had thinned, and a weak sun cast pale shadows across the yard. Hannah stood at the stable door, stroking Storm's muzzle through the half-open window, when she felt a prickle at the back of her neck. She looked up. Across the yard to the castle's upper windows, a figure stood at one of them, tall and dark, framed against the gray glass. He was too far away to see clearly, but she could feel the weight of his gaze, heavy as a stone. Then the figure moved and was gone. "Who was that?" she asked. Old Bram followed her gaze. His face went carefully blank. "That would be the Alpha King, lass. He watches from the high windows. He does that. Why doesn't he come down?" The old man was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Some men carry more than they can show, child. The weight doesn't make them cruel. It makes them still, like a tree that stands through a storm. It doesn't move, but that doesn't mean it isn't feeling the wind." Hannah did not understand. Not really, but she nodded and let the question rest. That evening, in his study, Nathaniel of House Thornwood sat before the fire with the letter in his hands. The paper was soft with age, creased along the folds where it had been opened and folded again countless times over 12 years. He knew the words by heart. He could have recited them in his sleep. "Nathaniel, if you are reading this, I have already gone to my rest. I asked only one thing of you, one thing, and then I will trouble you no more. My daughter, Hannah, she is 11 now, with gray eyes like mine, and a stubbornness I cannot claim to have taught her. I have raised her alone, and I have not told her of you. She does not know that I once loved, or that I was loved in return. She knows only that her mother was a widow who worked hard and hoped for a better life for her child. I am not asking you to love her. I am asking you to keep her safe, to give her a home if you can. I know I have no right to ask this. I know I made my choice, and I have lived with it. But you were the only one I ever trusted, and I trust you still. If you can find it in your heart, tell her about me. The good parts, the parts I could not bear to say aloud. If you cannot, if the past is too heavy, then let her go gently, but do not let her be alone in this world. She is all I have left, and I am giving her to you. Margaret." Nathaniel's thumb traced the edge of the page where the ink had blurred in one small spot, a tear. He had always thought, hers or his. He could not think longer tell. He had failed her once. He had let his father's will and his own cowardice tear them apart. He had stood in this very castle 20 years ago, watching the cart carry her away to a marriage that was not to him, and he had not run after her. He had stood still, as he always did, and let the silence swallow his courage, and she had not blamed him. That was the cruelest part. She had written to him, years later, only to tell him she was well, that she did not regret, that she hoped he would find peace. He had not found peace. He had found a kingdom and a duty and a hollow where his heart should have been. His eyes went to the fire. In the east wing, the girl, Margaret's girl, with Margaret's gray eyes, was sleeping beneath his roof. She did not know who he was to her. She did not know that the man who had taken her in was the same man her mother had loved, and lost, and forgiven, and he did not know how to tell her. He thought of the portrait in the great hall, the one she would surely see, the one she had glimpsed the night before, Margaret young and radiant, holding a spray of thorn flowers. He had commissioned it in the first year after she left, a secret act of grief, and he had never been able to take it down. The girl would ask, she would ask, and he would have to answer. He pressed the letter to his chest, feeling the paper against his heart, and closed his eyes. The fire crackled. The shadows danced, and in the east wing, the girl slept. Her mother's shawl clutched in her arms, her dreams filled with white horses and old men's stories, and the weight of an unseen gaze from a high window. The morning came slowly to Thornwood Castle, grey and soft as the ash of a dying fire. Hannah woke in the narrow bed with the old shawl clutched to her chest, and for one breath she did not know where she was. Then the smell of cold stone and wood smoke filled her nose, and she remembered. She was in the castle with the man who did not come down. Eleanor came in with a basin of warm water and a clean dress, plain grey wool that smelled faintly of lavender. "The Lord sent word you are to be fitted for proper clothes," she said, setting the basin on the table. "But that can wait. Eat first." There was porridge with honey on the tray and a small round of bread, still warm from the oven. Hannah ate slowly, carefully, the way her mother had taught her. "Do not wolf your food, love. It is a courtesy to the hands that made it." The thought of her mother made her throat tight, and she set down the spoon for a moment. Eleanor watched her with sharp, kind eyes. "You will wear yourself thin with worrying, child. The stones have stood here for 300 years. They will stand a little longer while you eat your breakfast." "Yes, Mistress Eleanor," Hannah said and picked up the spoon again. After the meal, Eleanor led her down a narrow stair and through a low door into the stable yard. The air was cold and bright, and the smell of hay and horses wrapped around her like a familiar hand. Old Bram was already there, his grey beard catching the light, his hands busy with a currycomb on the flank of the great white horse. "Ah, the little lass is back," he said, and his weathered face split into a grin. "Storm's been asking after you, haven't you, old girl?" The white horse turned her head and nickered softly, and Hannah felt something loosen in her chest. She stepped forward and laid her palm against the warm, broad cheek. The horse leaned into her touch, a great, gentle weight, and blew a soft breath across her hair. "She knows you, old," Az said, and there was something curious in his voice. "Strange, she does not take to most. Maybe she knows I am sad," Hannah said quietly. Old Bram was silent for a moment, then he nodded slowly, his eyes going distant. "Aye, lass, the old ones always know. They carry what we cannot, and they do not ask, for thanks." He ran the currycomb down Storm's neck in long, even strokes. "She was not always mine, you know. She came to the castle as a foal, years ago. The Lord himself picked her out of the herd, named her himself. Never told me why. But the stones remember everything, and they do not lie." Hannah looked up at the great white horse, and then at the castle walls rising beyond the yard. Somewhere in those walls was the man with the iron-grey eyes, the man who watched from high windows but never came down. She did not know why he had taken her in. She did not know who he was to her mother. She wanted to ask. The question sat in her throat like a stone. But she did not ask, and old Bram did not offer. And the morning passed in the quiet rhythm of the stable yard. It was late in the afternoon that Hannah lost her way. Eleanor had sent her to carry a small bundle of herbs to the kitchens, a simple errand she had done twice before. But the castle was a maze of twisting corridors and identical doors, and somewhere between the great hall and the scullery she took a wrong turn. The passage grew narrower, the light dimmer, and the sound of servants' voices faded behind her until there was only the soft scuff of her own footsteps on the stone. She should have turned back. She knew she should have turned back. But at the end of the corridor there was a door, slightly ajar, and through the crack came a shaft of pale gold light. It was warmer than the grey daylight elsewhere, like the glow of candles, or the last light of a long afternoon. Hannah pushed the door open with one small hand. It was a long, narrow room, lined with old tapestries and heavy furniture draped in dustcloths. The air smelled of old linen and dried flowers, and on the far wall, above a carved oak chest, hung a portrait. Hannah's breath stopped. The woman in the portrait was young, no older than her mother in the stories, with the same soft curve of the jaw and the same grey eyes. Her hair was the same pale flaxen color, pulled back in a loose braid, and on her left cheek, just above the smile, was a small, dark freckle. Hannah knew that freckle. She had traced it with her finger 100 times, on the face of the woman who had tucked her in at night, who had sung to her in a voice rough with tiredness, who had held her hand in the last cold hours and whispered, "You will be loved, my heart. You will be loved." Her mother was holding a spray of thorn flowers in the portrait, white and small and fierce, and she was smiling the way she had smiled only when she was truly happy. Hannah did not remember walking forward, but suddenly she was standing before the painting, her hand raised, her fingers hovering just above the painted cheek. "Why?" she whispered, and her voice cracked. "Why is my mother's portrait in your castle?"
She did not hear him approach, but she felt him. She turned, and Nathaniel of House Thornwood stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame, his iron-gray eyes fixed on her face. He was dressed in the same dark leather and wool he always wore, and his right hand was half closed at his side, the thumb moving slowly, endlessly, over the band of his iron ring. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched like a held breath.
Think? Hannah could hear her own heart beating, loud and fast, and she could see the flicker of something in his face that she could not name. It was not anger. It was not coldness. It was something older and rawer, and it made the lines around his eyes deepen. "You know her," Hannah said, and it was not a question. "You know my mother." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. His thumb stopped moving on the ring. For one breath she thought he would speak. She saw his lips part, saw the words gather in his throat, saw something like pain cross his face. Then he turned and walked away. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, heavy and slow, and Hannah stood alone in the dusty golden light, staring at the empty doorway, her mother's painted smile warm on the wall behind her. "Why won't you tell me?" she whispered to the silence. But the silence did not answer. Old Bree Fulton an hour later, curled on the floor at the foot of the portrait, her mother's shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She was not crying. She had stopped crying a long time ago. She was just sitting very small and very still, looking up at the painted face. "Ah, lass," the old man said softly, and he lowered himself onto the stone floor beside her with a creak of old bones. "You found the lady, then?" "She is my mother," Hannah said. "Her name was Margaret, and the Lord knew her, and he will not tell me how." Old Bram was quiet for a long time. He looked at the portrait, and then at the girl, and then at the portrait again. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "Aye," he said. "He knew her. And there are things a man carries that are too heavy to speak, even when he wants to. Some men, the more they feel, the less they say." "Did he love her?" Hannah asked. Old Bram's hand, resting, thinking in his knee, tightened. "Lass," he said, "I have worked in this castle for 40 years. I have seen lords come and go, and I have seen the high and mighty do cruel things and call them duty. But I have only ever seen one man plant a garden of thorn flowers for a woman he could not keep." He turned to look at her, and his old eyes were kind. "The stones remember everything, lass, and they do not lie. That man has carried your mother's name in his heart for 20 years, and I do not think he has ever once laid it down." Hannah looked up at the portrait again, at her mother's young, happy face, and she felt something shift inside her, like a lock turning in a door she had not known was closed. She did not know what to do with it. She did not know what to do with any of it, but she knew one thing now, for certain: the man who had taken her in was not a stranger, and before she left this castle, she would make him tell her why. The storm came up from the southern hills just before supper, dark and sudden, as if the sky had been holding its breath all day and finally let it out in one great heave. The first crack of thunder shook the windows in the kitchen, and Mistress Eleanor muttered something about the cook's bread rising at the wrong hour, which she always said when she was nervous about something else. Hannah stood at the narrow window in her small room, watching the rain come down in gray sheets across the courtyard. The old stones of the castle turned dark and gleaming, and the wind tore at the few leaves still left on the trees beyond the wall. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and thought about how her mother used to hate storms. Margaret had always been afraid of thunder, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in a quiet, tensing way. She would stop whatever she was doing and go very still. And Hannah, even as a small child, had learned to go and sit beside her, close enough to feel her heartbeat slow. It was one of the few things Hannah remembered clearly because it happened so often. They had lived through many storms, the two of them, in that little cottage with the leaky roof and the warm hearth that never quite reached the far corner of the room. Hannah pulled her mother's old shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried not to think about how thin it had become. The storm grew worse as the evening went on. Thunder rolled over the castle in waves, and the rain turned to hail for a time, beating against the windows like handfuls of small stones. Eleanor brought her a bowl of hot soup and a slice of bread, and fussed over whether the blankets on her bed were thick enough, and told her twice that the castle had stood for 300 years and was not about to fall down tonight. "You are safe here, child," Eleanor said, but her voice was kind, and she lingered a moment longer than she needed to. Then she was gone, and Hannah was alone again with the storm. She could not sleep. The thunder was too loud, and the wind made a low, mournful sound as it found its way around the old walls and through the gaps in the window frames. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to it, and she thought about her mother, and she thought about the portrait in the gallery, and she thought about the way the Alpha King had looked at her and said nothing at all. It was not a comfortable thought. She turned over and pressed her face into the pillow and tried very hard not to cry. That was when she heard it, a sound beneath the thunder. A voice shouting something in the courtyard below. Hannah sat up and went to the window, pressing her nose against the cold glass. At first she could see nothing but rain and darkness. Then a flash of lightning lit the yard, and she saw him. Old Bram. He was out in the storm, soaked to the skin, his gray hair plastered to his head, his big shoulders hunched against the wind. He was trying to fasten the stable door, which had come loose, and was banging back and forth in the gale. The horses inside were shifting and stamping, and Hannah could hear their nervous winds even through the thickness of the glass. Old Bram shouted something she could not make out, and lunged for the door again, and the wind tore it out of his hands and slammed it back against the wall with a crack that sounded like a tree breaking. Hannah did not stop to think. She grabbed the blanket off her bed, the thick wool one Eleanor had given her that very evening, the one that smelled faintly of lavender and was the warmest thing she had ever owned. She wrapped it around her shoulders and ran out of her room and down the narrow stairs, past the kitchen where the cook was stacking plates, and out into the storm. The rain hit her like a wall, cold and hard and relentless, soaking through her thin nightdress in seconds. The wind tore at her hair and pushed her sideways, and for a moment she thought she would be knocked off her feet. But she kept going, slipping on the wet stones, her bare feet freezing until she reached the stable yard. "Old Bram!" she shouted, but her voice was swallowed by the wind. He heard her anyway. He turned, his face streaming with rain, and his eyes went wide with alarm. "Lass, what are you doing out here? Get back inside!" But she was already there, shoving the blanket into his hands, and even though the wind tried to tear it away, she held on until he took it. "You need this," he said, shivering so hard she could barely get the words out. "You are soaked through. You will catch your death." Old Bram stared at her. The rain ran down his face and dripped off his chin, and he looked at the blanket in his hands and then at her, and something in his old face changed. "You came out in this," he said, and he did not sound old at all. He sounded strange, almost wondering. "You came out in this storm. For me." "You were shouting," Hannah said, as if that explained everything. "And the door was broken. I thought it would hit you." Old Bram stood there in the rain, holding her blanket, and for a moment he did not say anything at all. Then he shook his head, and he wrapped the blanket around his shoulders, and he put his big, weathered hand on her shoulder, his grip gentle. "Aye, lass," he said. "The door is fixed now. Come on, let us get you inside before you turn into a river." They made it back into the castle, dripping and shivering, and old Bile led her not to her room, but to the kitchen, where the great hearth was still burning. He sat her down on a stool near the fire and wrapped her in a dry cloth, and he was muttering under his breath the whole time, a low stream of old words she did not quite catch but understood anyway, because they sounded like a grandfather scolding a child he loved too much to be truly angry with. "Here," he said, and he pressed a warm cup into her hands. It was not soup, but something darker and sweeter, and it tasted of honey and herbs. She drank it in small sips, and the warmth spread through her chest and down into her fingers and toes. Old Bram sat down across from her, wrapped in her wet blanket, and he looked at her for a long time. "You are a good child," he said finally. "A good, kind child. Your mother raised you." "Bah!" Hannah looked down at her cup, and her eyes burned, but she did not cry. She had made a promise to herself a long time ago that she would not cry in front of people, because crying made people uncomfortable, and her mother had had enough discomfort in her life without Hannah adding to it. "She did her best," Hannah said quietly. "She did everything she could." "Aye," old Bram said. "I believe she did."
They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain and the wind and the crackle of the fire, and then a kitchen door opened and Mistress Eleanor came in, and she stopped short when she saw them. "What in the name of—" she began, and then she saw Hannah's wet hair and the blanket around old Bram's shoulders, and she understood. Her mouth pressed into a thin line, and she did not say anything about the wet footprints or the puddle forming on her clean floor. She just went to the stove and ladled out 2 bowls of soup and set them down on the table without a word. Hannah drank her soup, and she was warm for the first time since the thunder started. She did not see the Alpha the King that night. She did not see him standing in the doorway of the kitchen, 1 floor up in the shadows of the great hall, watching her through the gap in the heavy oak door. She did not see the way his hands tightened on the stone balustrade when he saw her sitting there wrapped in a dry cloth, her wet hair plastered to her head, a bowl of soup cradled in her small hands. She did not see him turn away, and she did not hear him say very quietly to the empty hall, "Just like her." But she did the next morning find an extra blanket folded at the foot of her bed. It was not the one she had given to old Bram. It was a new one, thick and soft, the color of deep gray wool, and its smell felt inkly of cedar and smoke. She wrapped it around herself and stood at the window, looking out at the storm-battered courtyard. The rain had stopped, and the sun was struggling through the clouds, pale and watery. There was a tray of food on the table by her bed, and beside it a small pot of honey. She had not asked for honey. She had not asked for anything. Hannah looked at the blanket, and then at the honey, and then at the pale morning light. And she thought about the way the Alpha King had looked at her in the gallery, and she thought about what old Bram had said, and she thought about the portrait of her mother with the thorn flowers in her hands. She still did not know why his castle held her mother's portrait, but she was beginning to think that maybe, just maybe, the man who had taken her in was not as cold as he wanted everyone to believe, and she was beginning to think that she wanted to find out for sure. The morning light came slow and pale through the narrow window of Hannah's room. She had slept with her mother's old shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and when she woke, she found that she had been clutching it so tightly that her fingers ached. She lay still for a long moment, listening. The castle was quiet. Somewhere far below, she could hear the faint clatter of the kitchens, the low murmur of servants beginning their day. It was a different kind of quiet than the village had known. Here, the quiet felt like it was waiting for something. Hannah washed her face in the cold water from the basin, and she braided her own hair the way her mother had taught her. It came out lopsided, the way it always did when she did it herself. Her mother's fingers had been quick and sure, and she had always hummed while she worked. A soft tune that Hannah could no longer quite remember. She looked at herself in the small, clouded mirror. Her face was thin, and her eyes looked too large for it. There was a smudge of dirt on her chin that she had missed. She wiped it away with the corner of her sleeve. Then she took a breath and she went out into the corridor. She had made a decision. She did not know exactly what she would say or how she would say it, but she had decided that she would find the Alpha King and that she would speak to him. Not about the portrait, not yet. But she wanted him to know that she was not afraid of his silence. The castle was a maze of stone corridors and winding staircases, and Hannah had learned only a small part of it. She walked past the kitchen, where Mistress Eleanor was already scolding a young maid about the bread. She walked past the great hall, where 2 servants were sweeping the hearth. She climbed a narrow staircase that she had not climbed before, and she found herself in a part of the castle she did not recognize. The corridor here was lined with tall windows, and the morning light fell in long, golden bars across the stone floor. At the end of the corridor there was a heavy oak door, slightly ajar. Hannah hesitated. She could hear no sound from beyond the door, but the light spilling through the gap was warm, and she was curious. And so she pushed the door open a little wider and stepped inside. It was a garden. Not the kind of garden she had known in the village, with rows of cabbages and herbs. This was a walled garden, enclosed by high stone walls, and it was full of thorn bushes. The thorns were thick and dark, and between them, here and there, small white flowers were blooming, late and stubborn in the autumn chill. Hannah stood very still. She had never seen anything like it. The thorn bushes were not wild. They had been planted in careful rows, and the paths between them were swept clean. Someone tended this place, and had tended it for a long time. She walked down the nearest path, her fingers brushing the dark green leaves. The white flowers had a soft, sweet smell, and she bent to look at one more closely.
It was small and delicate, with 5 petals and a golden heart. "You are early," the voice came from behind her, and Hannah startled. She turned quickly, and there he was. The Alpha King stood at the entrance to the garden, his tall figure filling the doorway. He was dressed as he always was, in dark leather and a heavy cloak, and his iron-gray eyes were fixed on her. He did not look angry. He looked surprised, and something else, something she could not quite name. "I am sorry," Hannah said quickly. "I did not mean to trespass. I was looking for you, and I found this place by accident." "You were looking for me?" "Yes, my lord, I wanted to—" She stopped. Now that she was here, standing before him in the quiet garden, her courage faltered. She looked down at her hands, and she saw that she was still holding her mother's shawl. "I wanted to thank you," she said quietly, "for the blanket and the honey. I did not ask for them, but they were there when I woke, and I knew they were from you." Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. Then he stepped into the garden, and the door swung shut behind him with a soft click. "There is a bench by the far wall," he said. "Sit with me." Hannah's heart gave a small, surprised thump. She had expected him to dismiss her, or to look at her with that guarded, silent expression he wore in the gallery. She had not expected him to ask her to sit. She followed him to the bench. It was old stone, worn smooth by years of yurthood. "Thank you." And it sat beneath the shade of a large, gnarled thorn tree. Nathaniel lowered himself onto it, and after a moment, Hannah climbed up to sit beside him, leaving a careful space between them. For a while, neither of them spoke. The garden was very quiet. A small bird landed on one of the thorn bushes and began to sing a thin, sweet song. "Is this your garden?" Hannah asked at last. "It is. It is very beautiful. I have never seen thorn flowers like these. They look like they should hurt you, but they smell so sweet." Nathaniel did not answer. He was looking at the thorn bushes, but Hannah had the feeling that he was not really seeing them. He was seeing something else, something far away. "My mother used to say that the sweetest flowers grow on the hardest vines," Hannah said, and her voice caught a little. She had not meant to bring up her mother. She had not meant to say that at all. But Nathaniel turned his head, and he looked at her, and his expression changed. The hardness in his face softened, just a little, like frost beginning to melt in the morning sun. "Your mother," he said slowly, "was wise." Hannah stared at him. Her heart was beating very fast now. "You knew her?" she said. It was not a question. She had known it, somehow, since the moment she saw the portrait. She had known it in the way the servants looked at her, in the way old Bram had spoken of her mother with such warmth. She had known it, and she had been afraid to say it out loud. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. The bird had stopped singing. The garden was so quiet that Hannah could hear her own breathing. "Yes," he said at last. His voice was low, and it sounded like it cost him something to say the word. "I knew her. She was here, once, when she was a girl, about your age." Hannah felt tears prick her eyes, and she blinked them away quickly. She did not want him to see her cry. She had made a promise to herself a long time ago that she would not cry in front of strangers. "She never told me about this place," Hannah said. "She never told me she had been here." "She did not like to speak of it," Nathaniel said. "Some things are too painful to speak of." Hannah looked down at her hands. The shawl was twisted around her fingers, the wool soft and worn. She could smell her mother on it, or she thought she could. Perhaps it was only a memory. "I miss her," Hannah whispered. "I miss her so much. Some days I think I cannot bear it." She had not meant to say that either. It had slipped out, like water finding its way through a crack in a stone. She braced herself for his silence, for the same wall of quiet that he had shown her in the gallery. But Nathaniel did not look away. He sat very still, his hands resting on his knees. And when he spoke, his voice was rough, like someone who had not used it for a long time. "I know," he said. "I know what it is to miss someone, to carry them with you, even when they are gone. It does not get easier, but it does get softer. The pain does not go away, but it becomes a part of you, and you learn to live with it." Hannah swallowed. Did you love her? The question hung in the air between them. Hannah held her breath. She had not meant to ask that either. She had not meant to ask any of this. But she was tired of not knowing, tired of the silence that surrounded her mother like a stone wall. Nathaniel was quiet for so long that Hannah thought he would not answer. Then he reached up, and he began to undo the buckle of his heavy cloak. Hannah watched, puzzled, as he shrugged the cloak from his shoulders and laid it across his knees. "Your hair," he said. "It has come loose." Hannah reached up and touched her head. Her braid had come undone, lopsided as it was, and strands of her pale hair were falling around her face. She had not noticed. "I will fix it," she said quickly. "I am sorry, I did not mean to. Sit still." His voice was quiet, but it stopped her. She sat still. Nathaniel took the shawl from her hands, gently, and laid it across her lap. Then he shifted on the bench, turning to face her a little more, and he reached for her hair. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. She felt his fingers, large and calloused, touch the back of her head. They were clumsy at first, unsure, and she felt him hesitate. "I have not done this in a long time," he said. "Not since—" He stopped and did not finish. He began to gather her hair in his hands. His movements were slow, careful, as if he were handling something fragile. He worked in silence, and Hannah sat very still, hardly daring to breathe. She felt him separate her hair into 3 strands, felt his fingers work them together. It was not as neat as her mother's braid, and it was not as fast. He made mistakes, and he started over twice, but he did not give up. "Why is your ring so warm?" Hannah asked softly. His hands paused. For a moment, the only sound was the wind in the thorn bushes. "The ring is old," he said at last. "It has been worn many years. It holds the warmth of the hand that wears it. It is beautiful." He did not answer. His fingers resumed their work, and after a while, he tied the end of the braid with a piece of leather cord that he took from his belt. "There," he said, and his voice was gruff. "It is not as fine as your mother's work, but it will hold." Hannah reached up and touched the braid. It was neat and tight, and it felt strange and wonderful to have someone else's hands in her hair again. "Thank you," she whispered. Nathaniel sat back on the bench. He looked tired, Hannah thought, and something else. Something that made him look younger and older, all at once. "My mother used to say that children should not grow up too fast," Hannah said quietly. "She said that there is time enough for grown-up sorrows." "Your mother was right," Nathaniel said. "She was right about many things." They sat in silence for a while longer. The sun had risen higher, and the light in the garden was bright and clear. The thorn flowers swayed gently in the wind. "Why did you bring me here?" Hannah asked at last. "To the castle, I mean. You did not know me. I was a stranger." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because your mother asked me to." Hannah's heart gave a small, painful lurch. "She asked you to take me in?" "She wrote to me," Nathaniel said, "before she passed. She asked me to keep you safe. She asked me to give you a home." Hannah felt the tears come then, and she could not stop them. She pressed her hand to her mouth, but they came anyway, hot and fast. "She knew," Hannah said, her voice breaking. "She knew she was going to leave me, and she sent me to you. She sent me to a stranger." "I was not a stranger," Nathaniel said quietly. "Not to her, and not to you, though you did not know it." Hannah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked at him through her tears, and she saw that his own eyes were bright, though he did not weep. "Will you tell me?" she asked. "Will you tell me about her? About this place? About why her portrait is in your castle?" Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. The wind moved through the thorn bushes, and a few of the white petals drifted to the ground. "Some day," he said, "when you are ready, I will tell you everything." "When will I be ready?" "Ask me again," he said, "when the snow falls, and I will answer." Hannah looked out over the garden at the thorn flowers and the old stone walls, and she felt something settle in her chest. It was not the aching loss she had carried with her for so long. It was something softer, something that felt just a little like hope. "All right," she said. "I will ask you again when the snow falls." They sat together on the old stone bench, the tall man and the small girl, and the morning light wrapped around them like a quiet promise. The days after the garden were quiet ones. Hannah settled into a rhythm at the castle, waking with the grey light, eating Mistress Eleanor's honeyed oats at the long kitchen table, and finding her way to the stables each afternoon to visit the old white horse. She did not see Nathaniel often. He was the Alpha King, and the Thornwood lands were wide and full of demands. But she felt his presence in small ways, the way a hearth is felt, even when you are not standing before it. A bowl of warm apples sat by her door, a new wool blanket on her bed, softer than the old one, the color of autumn leaves. She had stopped asking the servants about him. She had learned that they lowered their voices when his name came up, and that they looked at her with a strange mix of pity and curiosity that she did not yet know how to read. It was on the 6th morning, in the pantry off the great kitchen, that the wind began to blow from the past. Hannah had gone to fetch a jar of honey for Mistress Eleanor, who was busy kneading dough and humming to herself. The pantry door was heavy, and she had to push it with her whole small weight. It swung open with a groan, and she stepped inside, into the cool dark that smelled of dried herbs and apples and old wood. 2 of the younger maids were already in there, their backs to her, sorting sacks of flour. They did not hear her come in. "I still cannot believe it," one of them was saying, her voice low and quick. "Her, of all people, right here in the castle, eating at our table." "The girl is harmless enough," said the other maid, "but it is strange. The Alpha King has never taken in a stray before, not once, in all the years I have served here." "Aye, and there is a reason for that, I reckon. Do you remember what they used to say about him, back when he was young?" The first maid's voice dropped even lower. Hannah held her breath, the jar of honey cold in her hands. "They said there was a woman, once, a common girl, from one of the villages. He loved her, they said, truly loved her, but his father would not allow it. The Alpha King must marry for the sake of the house, not for love. So he let her go, sent her away." "Sent her away? He did not marry her?" "He did not, and she went on to wed another man, a farmer or a tradesman, someone of no consequence, and she lived a hard life, they say, a short one, too. She died young, not long ago, and left a child behind." There was a pause. Hannah heard the rustle of a sack being lifted, the soft thud of it being set down. "A child," the second maid repeated slowly. "A child, you say? And now the Alpha King has taken in an orphan girl from a village." "I am not saying it is the same child," the first maid said quickly. "I am only saying it is strange, the timing of it, the way he brought her here himself, the way he will not let anyone speak of it. It is as if he owes a debt to that woman, and he is paying it now, in this small way." "Or," said the second maid with a knowing little laugh, "it is guilt. A man does not abandon the woman he loves and then forget her. He carries it with him, and when she dies he tries to make it right, but it is too late. It is always too late for that kind of thing." Hannah stood in the doorway, the honey jar cold against her chest, and she felt the world tilt, slow and terrible, like a ship turning in a dark sea. They were talking about her mother. They had to be. A common girl from the villages, died young, left a child behind. A child. Her. She backed out of the pantry, silent as a shadow, and set the honey jar down on the floor by the door. She did not run. She walked, one step at a time, down the long corridor, past the kitchen, where Mistress Eleanor was humming, past the great hall with its tall, cold windows, until she reached the small room that had been given to her. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, and she stared at the wall. He had loved her mother. He had loved her, and he had sent her away. He had let her live a hard life, a short life, alone, and he had done nothing. And now he was here, with his warm blankets and his bowls of apples and his quiet voice, and she had been so foolish to think he was kind. The tears came, hot and angry, and she wiped them away with the back of her hand. She told herself she would not cry. Her mother had taught her that tears were for the ones who could not fight back, and she was not that. She was not.
But the tears came anyway, and she let them fall, because there was no one there to see. She did not go to the stables that afternoon. She did not go to the kitchen for her supper. She stayed in her room, and when Mistress Eleanor came to check on her, she said she tired, and she turned her face to the wall. The next morning she began to avoid him. It was not hard. The castle was large, and Nathaniel was often in his study or out in the fields seeing to the harvest. She learned the times when he walked the corridors, and she made sure to be elsewhere. She took her meals in the kitchen with Mistress Eleanor, and she went to the stables only when she knew Old Bram would be there alone. Old Bram noticed, of course. He noticed everything, though he pretended not to. "You are quieter than a mouse with a toothache, lass," he said on the third afternoon. As he brushed the old white horse, the animal stood patient and still, its breath misting in the cold air. "And you have not been near the great hall in days. Did the Alpha King do something to vex you?" "No," Hannah said too quickly. "He did nothing." "Aye, that is what people say when they do not want to speak of it." He looked at her, his old eyes sharp beneath their heavy brows. "The stones remember everything, lass, but they do not tell the whole story, not unless you ask the right questions." Hannah looked down at her hands. She had been twisting the hem of her old blue dress, the one her mother had mended so many times. It was fraying again, and she did not know how to mend it. "Old Bram," she said, her voice small, "did you know my mother?" The old man's hands stilled on the horse's flank. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he set down the brush and turned to face her. "I knew her," he said. "When she was a girl, not much older than you are now, she used to come to the stables, just like you do, to see the horses, especially the white ones." Hannah's heart gave a strange little lurch. "She came here? To the castle?" "She did. She was a ward of the old king, Nathaniel's father. She was raised here, in the West Tower, for a time. Her own people had died, and the old king took her in out of duty, or so the story goes." "She was raised here?" Hannah repeated, trying to understand. "But the maid said she was a common girl. From the villages, they said he sent her away." Old Bram let out a long breath, and his face grew grave. "Ah, lass, that is the trouble with listening to maigs who were not even born when it happened. They tell what they think they know, and they dress it up with their own imaginings." He sat down on a bale of hay, and he gestured for her to come and sit beside him. She did, her hands clenched tight in her lap. "Your mother was not sent away," he said. "She left of her own choosing. The old king, he wanted his son to marry a noblewoman from a great house across the mountains. His alliance, a political thing, the kind of thing that kings and lords do. Nathaniel, he was young then, and he loved your mother, and he did not want to let her go." "He loved her," Hannah whispered. The words felt strange in her mouth, like stones she had swallowed. "Aye, he loved her. But his father was a hard man, and he gave Nathaniel a choice. Marry the noblewoman, or be disinherited, cast out from the house of Thornwood, with nothing but his name and his sword." "And what did he choose?" Old Bram was silent for a long moment. The wind rattled the stable door, and the old white horse stamped its foot, as if it, too, was waiting for the answer. "He chose the duty," Old Bram said quietly. "He chose the house. He thought, in his youth, that he could make it right, that he could find a way to bring her back to him. But your mother, she was proud. She would not wait for a man who had chosen another. She left the castle, and she did not lose. Think back." Hannah felt the tears press at the back of her eyes, but she forced them down. "So he did abandon her. He chose the castle over her." "He chose what he was raised to choose," Old Bram said. "It does not make it right, lass, but it does not make it cruelty either. He was young, and he was afraid, and he made a choice that he has been paying for every day since." "How do you know?" Hannah asked. "How do you know he has been paying for it?" Old Bram's eyes went to the old white horse, and something soft passed over his weathered face. "Because I have been here, lass, for all of it.
I have seen him grow from a boy into a man, and I have seen the way he keeps things that remind him of her. The garden, with the thorn flowers, the room in the West Tower, locked and untouched, and this horse, this old white horse who is the child of the mare your mother used to ride. Hannah stared at him, her heart pounding. He kept her horse. He kept everything, old Bram said. He kept it all, the way a man keeps a wound that will not heal, not because he likes the pain, but because it is the only thing he has left of her. Hannah sat very still on the bale of hay, the words settling into her like stones into deep water. She had been so sure, so certain, that Nathaniel was the man who had abandoned her mother. But the story old Bram told was different. It was messier, sadder, and it did not have a clear villain. "He should have told me," she said at last, her voice barely a whisper. "He should have told me himself." "Aye," old Bram said gently, "he should have. But he is a proud man, and a guarded one, and he has spent so many years keeping his heart locked away that he does not know how to open the door. That is why the little girl with the steady eyes is here, lass. That is you are here, and not somewhere else." Hannah did not know what to say. She sat in the stable with the old man and the old white horse, and the cold wind rattled the door, and she felt the anger inside her begin to soften, just a little, like ice melting at the edges of a winter pond. She did not forgive him. Not yet. But she understood, a little, that there was more to the story than the maids had whispered, and she remembered in the quiet of her heart what he had said in the garden. "Ask me again when the snow falls, and I will answer." She looked out through the stable door, at the pale gray sky, and she wondered how far away the snow was. The night came cold and quiet, and the castle settled into its familiar hush. Somewhere below, the kitchen fire had burned down to embers, and the servants had long since gone to their beds. Even old Bram had left the stable, with a lantern and a grumbled warning to the old white horse to behave himself until morning. Hannah lay awake in the narrow bed in the corner room of the east wing. The blankets were thick and warm, softer than anything she had slept under in months, but she could not find sleep. Her mind kept turning, like a wheel that would not stop, around the things old Bram had told her in the stable that afternoon. She had been a ward here. She was not chased away. She left because she was proud. Hannah pressed her face into the pillow and tried to make the thoughts stop, but they would not. They kept circling back to the same place, to the man with the gray eyes and scar above his brow, to the way he had stood in the garden and told her to ask him again when the snow fell. She did not understand him. She did not understand why he kept her mother's portrait in his castle, why he kept a locked tower and an old wife, 2 horses, and a garden full of thorn flowers. She did not understand why he had looked at her that first day at the gate as if he had been waiting for her for a very long time, and she did not understand why she was angry at him, and also, somehow, not angry at all. The tears came before she could stop them. They were quiet tears, the kind she had learned to shed in the months since her mother had gone, the kind that made no sound and left no trace if you wiped your face quickly enough. She pressed her hand over her mouth and tried to be still, tried to be brave, tried to be the girl who said, "I am all right," and meant it. But the loneliness was too heavy tonight. It sat on her chest like a cold stone, and she missed her mother with a fierceness that ached all the way down to her bones. She did not hear the footsteps in the corridor. She did not hear the soft creak of the floorboards outside her door. She only knew, after a long while, that when she opened her eyes and turned toward the crack beneath the door, there was a faint, warm light there. Someone had set a candle on the floor outside her room. Hannah held her breath. She slipped out of bed and padded to the door on bare feet, her old blue nightgown trailing behind her. She pressed her eye to the crack, and what she saw made her go very still. Nathaniel, the Alpha King of Thornwood, was sitting on the stone floor of the corridor, with his back against the wall and a single candle burning on the flagstones beside him. He was still in his dark tunic, his boots dusty from the day, his head tilted back against the cold stone. He was not looking at her door. He was looking down the corridor, toward the dark window at the end of the hall, where the night pressed against the glass like a patient animal. He was not doing. think anything. He was not guarding her, not speaking, not even watching her door. He was simply sitting there, in the cold, with a candle, as if he meant to stay until the light burned down to nothing. Hannah pulled back from the door. Her heart was beating strangely, and her throat felt tight. She did not know what to make of it. She had heard the servants whisper that the Alpha King was a hard man, that he did not smile, that he had a temper like a winter storm. But this man, sitting on the cold floor with a candle, did not look hard at all. He looked tired. He looked like someone who did not know how to say the things he carried. She went back to bed, but she left the door cracked just a little, so the light from the candle could find its way into her room. And for the first time in many nights, she did not feel quite so alone. She woke again in the deep dark of the night, near dawn, when the cold had crept into every corner of the room. The candlelight had burned low, a small, stubborn flame in the darkness. She lay still for a moment, listening, and then she heard it very faint from the other side of the door. He was humming. It was a low, rough sound, barely more than a breath, the kind of humming a man does when he thinks no one is listening. It was an old tune, slow and a little sad, and Hannah realized with a start that she knew it. Her mother used to hum that tune. In the evenings, when the work was done and the fire was low, Margaret would sit by the hearth and hum that same slow melody, her hands busy with mending or folding, her eyes far away. Hannah had never known the words. She had only known the shape of it, the way it folded around her like a familiar blanket. She lay in the dark and listened, and the tears came again, but softer this time. They were not the bitter tears of the evening. They were something else, something she did not have a name for. She fell asleep to the sound of that old tune, and for the first time in weeks she did not dream of the cold. When she woke, the candle was gone. The door was shut, and the corridor beyond was quiet. For a long moment Hannah lay still, wondering if she had dreamed it all, the candle, and the humming, and the man sitting on the cold floor. But when she rose and opened the door, she saw it. A small, melted stub of wax, no bigger than her thumb, sitting in a little hollow in the flagstones. Someone had pressed it there, carefully, so it would not be blown out by the draft. She knelt and picked it up. It was still faintly warm. The morning light was thin and gray, and the castle was beginning to stir. Hannah could hear the distant clatter of the kitchens, the low voices of servants beginning their day. She stood in the corridor with the little stub of wax in her hand, and she did not know what to do with the feeling that was swelling in her chest. She walked down the corridor, past the window at the end of the hall, and there he was. Nathaniel was standing at the far end of the passage, near the stair that led down to the great hall. He had his back to her, and he was looking out the narrow window at the pale sky. He had not changed his clothes. He looked as if he had not slept at all. Hannah stopped. She opened her mouth, but no words came. She stood there holding the little stub of wax, and she watched him for a long moment. And then, before she could stop herself, she said, very quietly, "You hummed my mother's song." He went still. He did not turn around. For a long moment he said nothing, and Hannah thought she had made a terrible mistake, that she should not have said "Roter," and he would turn and look at her with that cold, flat gaze and tell her she was being foolish. But he did not. He turned slowly and looked at her. His gray eyes were tired, and there was something in them that she had not seen before, something soft and guarded and almost afraid. "She used to hum it," he said, and his voice was low and rough, as if the words cost him something. "She hummed it in the garden, in the summer, when she was a girl. I have not heard it in a very long time." Hannah's throat tightened. "I did not know you knew her. I mean, I knew you knew her, because of the portrait, but I did not know you knew her like that." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I knew her." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with everything they did not say. Hannah wanted to ask more. She wanted to ask him why he had been sitting outside her door all night, why he had hummed that old tune, why he kept her mother's portrait in his castle. But the words would not come. They felt too big, too heavy, too much like opening a door she was not ready to walk through. So she said instead, "I am all right. You did not have to sit there." He looked at her for a long moment, and then very quietly he said, "I know." He did not say anything else. He did not explain. did not apologize, did not try to make it into something smaller than it was. He simply stood there, in the gray morning light, and let the silence hold them both. Hannah looked down at the little stub of wax in her hand. She turned it over, and she saw in the faint light the mark of his thumb pressed into the soft wax. A small, careful impression, as if he had held it there for a long time before setting it down. She looked up at him. My mother used to say that the cold is easier to bear. We think someone stays awake with you. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He did not look away. She was right, he said. Hannah did not know what to say to that. So she did the only thing she could think of. She stepped forward and she held out the little stub of wax to him. Thank you, she said, very quietly, for staying awake. He looked at the wax in her palm for a long moment. Then he reached out and his big, calloused hand closed around it and he tucked it to a pocket of his tunic. You are welcome, he said, and his voice was rough, but it was not cold. It was the voice of a man who had been silent for a very long time and had only just remembered how to speak. Hannah turned and walked back to her room. At the door, she paused and looked back. He was still standing there watching her, and for a moment she thought she saw something move in his face, something that might have been a smile. She went inside, and she closed the door, and she pressed her back against cool wood. Her heart was beating fast, and there was a strange warm feeling in her chest, like the last ember of a fire that had not quite got out. She did not know what it meant. She did not know if she forgave him, or if she ever could. But she knew, for the first time since she had come to this castle, that she was not alone, and she remembered, in the quiet of her heart, the way he had hummed her mother's song in the dark, and the way his thumb had pressed into the wax, as if he had been holding on to something for a very long time. She looked out the window, at the pale gray sky, and she thought about the snow that had not yet fallen, and she thought about the promise he had made her in the garden. Ask me again when the snow falls, and I will answer. She did not know how far away the snow was, but for the first time she thought she might be willing to wait. The days after the garden were quiet ones, and Hannah found herself walking the castle corridors more slowly than before, as if the stones themselves had something to tell her. She no longer flinched when a servant passed her in the hall, and she had stopped counting the candle holders on the walls. The castle was beginning to feel less like a cage and more like a place that held its breath, waiting for something she could not name. She thought about the song often, the way Nathaniel had hummed it in the dark, low and careful, as if he were afraid of breaking it. She had tried to hum it herself one morning, sitting on the edge of her bed, but the melody slipped away from her, and all she could remember was the shape of it, the way it had curled around her like a warm hand. On the fourth morning after the garden, old Bram found her in the stable, sitting on an upturned bucket, watching Storm chew his hay. The old horse flicked his ears at her, and she reached out to pat his nose, and he let her, the way he always did. You are up early, lass, Bram said, leaning on his pitchfork. The sun is barely over the wall. I could not sleep, she said. I keep thinking about things. Aye, Bram nodded slowly. That is the trouble with thinking. It does not let a body rest. She was quiet for a moment, and then she asked the question that had been sitting in her chest since the night in the garden. Old Bram, did you know my mother? The old man went still. His hand stopped on the pitchfork, and he looked at her for a long moment. And then he looked away, out the stable door, at the gray sky beyond. Aye, lass, he said, and his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. I knew her. She was a wild thing, your moth fast as a hare and twice as stubborn. Hannah felt her heart quicken. She was here? In this castle? Bram was quiet for a long time. He reached out and ran his hand along Storm's neck, and the old horse leaned into his palm, and the two of them stood there in the quiet of the stable, the hay dust floating in the pale morning light. There is a tower, Bram said at last, his voice low. The west one. It has been locked for 20 years, but it was her room, once. When she was your age, she used to sit in that window and watch the riders come in from the road, and she would say she was going to ride out and see the whole world someday. Hannah stood up slowly. Her hands were trembling, and she did not know why. Can I see it? Bram shook his head. It is not my place, lass. The key is with the master. It has always been with him. He looked at her, and there was something gentle in his old eyes, something that looked almost like pity. But if you ask him, I do not think he will say no, not to you. The walk back to the castle felt longer than it should have. Hannah's legs were heavy and her heart was beating fast, and she kept turning Bam's words over in her mind. Her mother had lived here. Her mother had sat in a tower window and watched the road and dreamed of the world, and Nathaniel had kept that room locked for 20 years. She found him in the great hall, standing by the hearth, looking at the fire. He did not turn when she came in, but she knew he had heard her, because his shoulders shifted just slightly the way they did when he was aware of someone behind him. "My lord," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. He turned, his gray eyes met hers, and there was something in them that she could not read, something careful and guarded, like a man standing at the edge of a cliff. "Old Bram told me something," she said. "He said the West Tower was my mother's room. He said it has been locked for 20 years. Nathaniel said nothing. His thumb moved to the iron ring on his finger, and he pressed it, once, the way he always did when he was thinking. "I would like to see it," Hannah said. "Please." The silence stretched between them, long and heavy. Hannah held her breath. She had seen him look at her with distance and with a strange, careful softness, but she had never seen him look the way he did now, as if she had asked him to open a door he had spent 20 years learning to keep shut. "It has not been opened in a long time," he said at last, and his voice was rough, like a man who had not used it much. "I know," she said, "but she was my mother, and I never got to know her." Nathaniel closed his eyes. For a moment he was perfectly still, and then he reached into his tunic and pulled out a key, old and black with age. It hung on a leather cord, and Hannah saw that the cord was worn thin, as if it had been handled many times, though the key itself was bright where it had been turned. "Come," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "I will show you." The West Tower was colder than the rest of the castle. The stones were damp, and the air smelled of dust and old wood, and the stairs spiraled up into shadow. Nathaniel went first, his boots echoing on the stone, and Hannah followed, her hand brushing the cold wall to steady herself. At the top of the stairs there was a door. It was plain, made of dark oak, with a single iron handle. The wood was scarred and worn, as if it had been touched many times, and Hannah saw that there were faint scratches around the lock, as if someone had tried to turn Tannum. "He key in the dart." Nathaniel stopped in front of the door. He stood there for a long moment, his hand on the key, and Hannah saw his shoulders rise and fall, with a breath he did not let out. "She used to say," he said, his voice low, "that this was the highest point in the castle. She said you could see the whole world from here, if you knew where to look." He turned the key. The lock gave a soft, tired click, and the door swung open, and the smell of old air and dried flowers drifted out, and Hannah stepped past him, into the room that had been her mother's. It was small. A narrow bed against one wall covered in a faded quilt, a wooden chair by the window, its cushion thin and worn. A small writing desk, its surface bare, with a single dried flower lying on it, brown and fragile. And the walls. The walls were covered in scratches, small and delicate, covering every inch. And when Hannah stepped closer, she saw that they were not scratches at all. They were names. Dozens of them, hundreds of them, written in a child's careful hand. Margaret, Margaret, Margaret. Her name, Hannah whispered. "She used to practice writing it," Nathaniel said. He was standing in the doorway, not coming in, as if the room belonged to someone else and he had no right to cross the threshold. "She told me she wanted to write it beautifully so that when she signed her name in the great book of the world, it would be worthy." Hannah walked to the window. It looked out over the road, the long gray road that led away from the castle, toward the village and the forest and the world beyond. She thought about her mother, a girl her age, sitting on this very window seat watching that road, dreaming of the places she would go. And she thought about how her mother had gone, and how she had come back, and how she had never made it to any of those places she had dreamed of. Her eyes burned. She blinked, and a tear slid down her cheek, and she wiped it away quickly, the way she always did, because she was supposed to be all right. She felt him move before she heard him. Nathaniel crossed the room, slow and careful, and stopped a step behind her. He did not touch her. He just stood there, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her back, and she looked out at the road, and she said very quietly, "She never got to see the world." No, Nathaniel said. His voice was rough, and she heard something in it she had not heard before, something that sounded like grief. She did not. But she saw the sky from this window, and she saw the stars, and she told me once that she had decided the world could wait, that she was happy here. For a while. Hannah turned to look at him. His face was shadowed, his gray eyes dark, and there was a muscle in his jaw that was tight, as if he were holding something back. He was looking at the window, not at her, and she saw his throat move as he swallowed. "Did you love her?" Hannah asked. The question hung in the air between them. Nathaniel was very still, and for a long moment she thought he would not answer. But then he reached up, slowly, and touched the wall, where her mother's name was carved in the stone. His thumb traced the letters, over and over, and when he spoke, his voice was so low she almost did not hear it. "I did," he said. "I loved her more than I knew how to say, and I have spent 20 years wondering if she knew." His hand dropped. He turned away from the wall and he looked at her, and there was something raw in his face, something that he had been hiding for a very long time, and he did not hide it now. "I am. Think. Something. Not happened. I should have told you before. I should have told you the day you came, but I did not know how to say it, and I was afraid." Hannah looked at him, at the tall man with the gray eyes and the scarred brow, and she saw that he was afraid. She saw it in the way his hands hung at his sides, still and careful, and in the way he did not try to reach for her. He was afraid, and she understood, because she was afraid too. Afraid of what it meant that her mother had been here, that this man had loved her, that there was a whole story she had never known. She stepped forward. She did not think about it. She just did it. She crossed the small room, and she stopped in front of him. And she looked up at him, and she said, "What was her song about?" Nathaniel blinked. The question seemed to catch him off guard, and he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It was about a girl who planted a garden. And the garden grew, and it was beautiful, and she was happy. But the winter came, and the garden slept, and the girl waited. She knew the spring would come again, because it always did." He looked at the window, and his voice dropped. "She used to say the song was about hope, about believing that the cold would not last forever." Hannah stood in the quiet of the room, and she heard her mother's song in her mind, the shape of it, the warmth of it, and for the first time she thought she understood what it meant. "Thank you," she said, "for showing me this room, for telling me about her." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and he reached out, and he did something she had not expected. He held out his hand, palm up the way he had in the garden, and he waited. She took it. His hand was warm and rough, and it closed around hers gently, the way it had before, and she felt the cold of the tower room ease a little, as if he had brought a small warmth into it with him. "Come," he said. "It is getting cold. Let us go back to the fire." They walked down the spiral stairs together, his hand still holding hers, and when they reached the bottom, he let go, and she did not mind. She had learned, in the weeks since she had come to this castle, that his kindness was not loud. It was quiet and careful, and it showed up in the small things. That evening she sat by the hearth in the great hall, and Nathaniel sat across from her, reading a book she could not see. The fire crackled between them, and the shadows danced on the walls, and she felt the weight of the day settle into her bones. She thought about her mother, carving her name into the stone. She thought about the window and the road and the dream of the world, and she thought about Nathaniel, standing in the doorway, afraid to cross the threshold, keeping the key for 20 years. She looked up at him. He was reading, his brow furrowed, his thumb absently pressing the iron ring on his finger. And she said, "I think she knew." Nathaniel looked up. His eyes met hers, and there was a question in them, and she did not know how to answer it. So she just said, "I think she knew you loved her. Mothers know those things." He was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled, and a log settled, and a shower of sparks rose up the chimney. And then he said, very softly, "I hope so." That night,
When Hannah went to bed, she lay awake for a while, looking at the ceiling. The room was warm, and the silence was comfortable, and she did not feel the ache in her chest the way she usually did. She thought about her mother, and she thought about the tower, and she thought about the song, and she felt for the first time that she was beginning to understand something important. She was beginning to understand that her mother had been loved, not just by her, but by someone else. Someone who had kept a room locked for 20 years because he could not bear to let it go. She closed her eyes, and as she drifted toward sleep, she hummed the song, softly, the melody coming to her at last. It was about a girl who planted a garden, and the garden slept through the winter, and the girl waited, because she knew the spring would come again, because it always did. In the morning, when she looked out her window, the sky was white and heavy, and the first flakes of snow were falling soft and silent on the gray stones of the castle. The snow had come. The snow fell all day, soft and steady, and by evening the castle courtyard was white, and the towers wore caps of pale silver, and the world was quiet in the way it only is when snow is falling. Hannah stood at her window for a long time, watching the flakes drift past, and she thought about the promise Nathaniel had made in the garden. "Ask me again when the snow falls, and I will answer." The snow had fallen, and she knew with a certainty she could not explain that tonight was the night she would ask. She found him in the great hall, standing by the hearth looking into the fire. He did not turn when she came in, but she knew he had heard her, because his shoulders shifted, and his hand went to the iron ring on his thumb, and he pressed it. Once. "My lord," she said. "Come here, Hannah." His voice was low, and there was something in it that made her heart quicken. She crossed the room and stood beside him, and he looked down at her, and his gray eyes were soft in the firelight. "The snow has come," he said. "Yes,"
He said, "It has." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "I made you a promise, and I intend to keep it." He turned from the fire, and he walked toward the corridor, and after a moment she followed. He led her through the castle, past the kitchens, past the great hall, past the servants' quarters, until they came to the long corridor where the portraits hung. He stopped in front of her mother's portrait. Hannah had not been here since the day she had found it. She had avoided this corridor, had taken the long way around, had told herself she did not need to see it again. And now, here she was, standing in front of it, looking up at her mother's young face, at the gray eyes that were so much like her own, at the left cheek where a small dark freckle sat in the exact same place as Hannah's. "The freckle," she whispered. "She had it too?" "Yes," Nathaniel said. "She did." He reached up, and she saw that his hand was trembling. He touched the frame of the portrait gently, the way he had touched her mother's name carved in the tower wall. And then he did something she did not expect. He lifted the painting off its hook, and he turned it over, and he held it out to her. "Look," he said. "I should have shown you this the day you came." Hannah looked at the back of the painting, and she saw that it was not blank. There were words written there, in an old hand, the ink faded and brown with age. She leaned closer, and she read, "Margaret, I have written this letter 100 times, and I have torn it up 100 times. I do not know if I will ever have the courage to give it to you, but I am writing it anyway, because if I do not write it, I think I will carry it in my chest until the day I die. I have loved you since the summer you sat in the West Tower window, and it told me you were going to see the whole world. I have loved you since the day you laughed at my horse for sneezing in the hay. I have loved you since the moment I saw you, and I have not stopped loving you since, and I do not think I ever will. I know that I am not free to love you the way I want to. I know that my father has arranged a marriage, and that I am bound by duty, and that I have no right to ask anything of you. But I need you to know that if ever you need a place to belong, my sword and my heart are yours. If ever you are in trouble, if ever you are alone, if ever the world is too much for you, you come to me. I will not fail you. I swear this on my name, on my honor, on my life. I am a coward. I know that. I am a coward who loves you and who cannot say it to your face. And so I am writing it here, on the back of this painting, where perhaps you will never see it. But if you do see it, I want you to know that it was always you. It was always you, Margaret. It will always be you. I will wait for you, if you will have me. And if you will not, I will wait anyway, because I do not know how to do anything else. Yours, always. Nathaniel Hannah read the letter twice. The words blurred in front of her, and she blinked, and a tear slid down her cheek, and she wiped it away. But another one came, and another, and she could not stop them. She looked up at him. He was standing very still, his hands at his sides, his gray eyes dark with something she could not name. He looked afraid. He looked like a man who had just laid down a burden he had carried for 20 years, and did not know if the person he had laid it at would pick it up or walk away. He wrote this, she said, and her voice was thick. 20 years ago. Yes, he said. He never gave it to her. No, he said, I did not. I was a coward, and I did not give it to her, and I have regretted it every day since. Hannah looked back at the letter. She read the words again. If ever you need a place to belong, my sword and my hearth are yours. She thought about her mother, alone in the village with a child, never asking for help, never coming to this castle. And she thought about Nathaniel, keeping this letter hidden behind a painting, keeping the tower room locked, keeping her mother's memory alive in 100 quiet ways. She never knew, Hannah said, her voice broke. She never knew you wrote this. No, Nathaniel said. She did not. Hannah turned the painting over, and she looked at her mother's face, at the young woman with the gray eyes and the small, dark freckle, and she said very quietly, Why did she leave? Why did she never come back? Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, She did not want to be a burden. That was what she told me, the last time I saw her. She said I had my duty, and my name, and my future. She said she would not be the one to take any of it away from me. He swallowed. I told her that she could never be a burden. I told her that I would give up everything for her. And she smiled, and she touched my face. And she said, That is why I have to go. Because you would give up everything, and I will not let you. Hannah felt the tears streaming down her face. She did not try to stop them. She stood there, holding the painting, looking at her mother's face, and she understood, in a way she had not understood before, why her mother had been the way she was, why she had never complained, why she had never asked for help, why she had carried everything alone. She thought she was protecting you, Hannah said. Yes, Nathaniel said, and I have spent 20 years wishing she had not. He stepped forward. He stopped in front of her, and he reached out and he gently took the painting from her hands. He turned it over so that the letter was face up, and he looked at it, and his thumb traced the faded ink. I have kept this letter for 20 years, he said. I have kept this painting and this castle and the room in the tower. I have kept them all because I could not let her go. He looked at Hannah and his eyes were wet. And when I got her last letter, the one she wrote before she died, she asked me to find you. She asked me to take care of you. She said, He is the only one I ever trusted. He reached into his tunic and he pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased. He held it out to her and she took it, and she unfolded it, and she saw her mother's handwriting, small and careful. The same hand that had carved her name in the tower wall. Hannah, if you are reading this, I am gone. I am sorry I could not stay longer. I am sorry I could not watch you grow up. I am sorry for all the things I will not get to see. But I want you to know the truth. There was a man, once, a man who loved me more than I knew how to deserve. His name is Nathaniel, and he is the Alpha King of Thornwood, and he is the only person I ever trusted with my heart. I left him because I loved him too much to let him give up his world for me. I was young, and I was proud, and I thought I was doing the right thing. I do not know if it was right. I have wondered every day if it was right. But I know this, if you ever need a place to belong, he will not fail you. He made me a promise, once, and he is a man who keeps his promises. Go to him, if you can. Let him take care of you. He will not let you down. I love you, my da.
Annakok. Liding, I have loved you from the moment I knew you were coming, and I will love you until the end of time. Your mother.
Margaret. Hannah read the letter twice,
And then she looked up at Nathaniel, and she saw that he was crying, silent tears running down his face, and he did not try to hide them. "She trusted me," he said, his voice rough. "She trusted me, and I did not fail her. I found you. I brought you here. I kept my promise." Hannah looked at the 2 letters, the one written 20 years ago, the one written before her mother died. She looked at the portrait, at her mother's young face, at the freckle on her cheek, and she thought about the tower room, and the song, and the candle in the dark. She thought about the way he had held her hand in the garden, and the way he had told her she could stay, and the way he had kept her mother's memory alive in 100 quiet ways. She stepped forward. She reached out and she took his hand, the one with the iron ring, and she held it between both of hers. "Your ring," she said. "Where did it come from?" He looked down at her small hands holding his, and he said, very quietly, "She gave it to me. The night before she left, she took it off her own finger and she put it on mine, and she said, 'So you will not forget me.'" "I have never taken it off," he said. "It has been 20 years, and I have never once taken it off." Hannah held his hand. She looked up at him, at the tall man with the gray eyes and the scarred brow, and she saw him, really saw him. For the first time, she saw the man who had loved her mother, who had written a letter he never sent, who had kept a room locked for 20 years, who had sat outside her door all night because she was crying. She saw the man who had promised to answer her when the snow fell. Had kept that promise. "I want to stay," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not waver. "I want to stay. If you will have me." Nathaniel went very still. He looked at her, and his gray eyes were bright with unshed tears, and his hand tightened around hers. "If I will have you," he said, and his voice cracked. "Hannah, I have been waiting for you to say that since the day you arrived." He knelt down so that he was at her eye level, and he looked at her and he said, "I cannot replace your mother. I cannot pretend that I am her, or that I can love you the way she did. But I can promise you this. You will never be alone again. You will always have a home here. You will always have a place to belong." Hannah did not think about it. She just did it. She stepped forward and she wrapped her arms around him and she held on tight. He went very still, and then his arms came around her, gently, carefully, as if he was afraid she would break. He held her, and she pressed her face into his shoulder, and she cried, and he did not tell her to stop. He just held her, and she felt his hand, warm and rough, resting on her back. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for keeping your promise." He did not answer, but she felt his arms tighten around her, and she knew that he understood. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the snow fell softly beyond the windows, and the 2 of them stood there, holding each other, and the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was warm, and it was safe, and it was the silence of 2 people who had finally found each other. She pulled back, finally, and wiped her eyes. She looked up at him, she smiled, a small, watery smile, and she said, "I think Mother would have liked it here." Nathaniel's eyes were wet, but he smiled too. A smile, long, daireful smile, like a man who had not used it in a long time. "She did," he said. His voice was low and rough and warm. "She told me, once, that this was the only place she ever felt like she belonged." Hannah looked at him, and she believed him. The room was quiet, and the air inside was still and cold, as if it had been waiting a long time for someone to breathe it. Hannah stood in the middle of it, turning slowly, taking in the narrow bed with its faded blue coverlid, the small writing desk beneath the window, the dried bouquet of thorn flowers standing in a clay jug on the sill. The petals were brown and brittle, but they had not been thrown away, they had been kept, and that meant something. Nathaniel stood by the door, his hand resting on the frame, watching her. He did not speak, and Hannah did not ask him to. She understood in a way she could not put into words that this room was a kind of shrine, and that the man standing in the doorway had been its only keeper for 20 years. She walked to the window and looked out at the snow falling over the courtyard. The glass was old and wavy, and the world beyond it looked soft and blurred like a memory. She touched the sill, and her fingers found the marks before her eyes did. 2 letters, carved deep into the wood, side by side, a looping M and a straight, careful N. She traced them with her fingertip, and her breath caught. "You carved these," she said. It was not a question. He was quiet for a long moment.
Then he said, "She was 15. I was 16. We thought the marks would last forever." His voice was low and rough, as if the words had to push their way past something lodged in his throat. We were not wrong. Hannah turned to look at him. The firelight from the corridor behind him threw his shadow, long across the floor. He looked older in that moment, and smaller, and she thought that she had never seen a king look so much like a man who had been waiting. "Why did you never tell me?" she asked. Her voice was small, but it did not shake. "Why did you let me think you were a stranger who just took me in?" He took a step into the room, then stopped, as if the threshold itself had a claim on him. "Because I did not know how," he said. "Because I have spent 20 years learning how to be silent, and I had forgotten how to be anything else." Hannah looked down at the dried thorn flowers. They were the same flowers that grew wild along the edge of the thornwood, the ones with the white petals and the sharp, stubborn stems. The same flowers her mother had held in the portrait. She reached out and touched one of the brittle petals, and it crumbled at her touch. "Mother never told me about you," she said. "She never said your name." She paused, and her voice cracked just a little. "She never said I had anyone." Nathaniel crossed the room slowly, and he stopped beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, but not touching. He looked down at the flowers, and his jaw tightened. "She did not know how to tell you," he said. "She was proud. Your mother, proud and stubborn and afraid of being a burden. She thought that if she told you about me, you would want to come here, and she could not bear the thought of you wanting something she could not give you." He paused, and his voice dropped. "She was wrong. But I did not know it then, and by the time I did, she was gone." Hannah looked up at him. Her eyes were bright with tears, but she did not let them fall. "She wrote to you," she said. "Before she died, she wrote to you, and you came." "Yes." His voice was barely above a whisper. "She wrote to me. A letter I had waited 20 years to receive, and I would have given everything I owned to never have read it." "Why?" Hannah asked. "Why would you rather not have read it?" He turned to look at her, and his gray eyes were wet. "Because the letter told me she was dying, and it asked me to find you and to keep you safe. And I knew, when I read it, that she had spent her whole life trying not to need me, and that she had only reached out when she had no other choice." His voice broke on the last word. "And I knew that I had failed her, that I had let my fear keep me from her, and that she had paid for it with a lifetime of loneliness." Hannah stood very still. The tears were falling now, but she did not wipe them away. "She was not lonely," she said. "She had me." Nathaniel looked at her, and something in his face shifted, like ice cracking in a thaw. "Yes," he said, and his voice was thick. "She had you, and that was her great victory, and my great loss. She had you, and I had nothing but a ring and a memory and a room full of things she had touched." He reached into his collar and pulled out a thin chain. At the end of it, threaded onto the leather cord, was a small iron key, black with age. He held it out to her, and she took it, turning it over in her small hands. "This key opens a chest in the corner of this room," he said. "I have not opened it in 20 years. I think it is time you saw what is inside." Hannah looked at the chest, a low wooden box at the foot of the bed bound with iron straps that had rusted to a dark brown. She walked to it slowly, knelt down, and fitted the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click, and she lifted the lid. Inside, folded neatly, was a woman's dress, a soft gray blue, color of a winter sky. On top of the dress lay a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon and a small leather pouch. Hannah lifted the pouch first and opened it. Inside was a lock of hair, pale and fine, the color of her own. She looked up at him. "This is hers," she said. "This is my mother's hair." He nodded, not trusting his voice. Hannah set the pouch down gently and picked up the letters. The top one was addressed in a hand she did not recognize, a man's hand, bold and angular. She looked at the bottom of the page and saw the signature, Nathaniel. "He wrote to her," she said, mostly to herself. "He wrote to her,
and she kept them. They were never sent, Nathaniel said quietly. I wrote them, but I never sent them. I was too afraid. He paused. She kept them anyway. She kept them without ever reading them. She told me once, years later, that she knew they were there, and that it was enough to know that I had written them at all. Hannah unfolded the top letter. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible, and she read them slowly, her lips moving soundlessly. My dearest Margaret, the letter began. I have written this letter 100 times, and I have burned every one. But I will keep this one, because tonight the moon is full, and I can hear the wolves in the thornwood, and I cannot stop thinking about the way you laughed when I told you I was afraid of the dark. You said that was foolish, because I was the one who taught you not to be. But the truth is, Margaret, that you taught me. You taught me that there is no shame in needing someone, and I need you. I need you more than I have ever needed anything, and I am too much of a coward to tell you to your face. Hannah read on. The letter went on to speak of small things, the way the frost had painted he windows that morning, the way the old mare had foaled a healthy colt, the way he had seen a girl in the village who walked like her, and it had made his chest ache. And at the bottom, written in a slightly different hand, as if he had added it later, were the words, If ever you need a place to belong, my sword and my hearth are yours. They have always been yours. They will always be yours. N.O. Hannah read the words twice, and then a third time, and then she folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest. She did not try to stop the tears, and she did not want to. They fell freely, and she let them. He loved her, she said, her voice breaking. He really loved her. Nathaniel knelt down beside her, his knees cracking on the cold stone floor. He did not touch her, but he was close, and his voice was gentle in a way she had never heard it. I loved her, he said. I loved her with everything I had, and I was too young and too proud and too afraid to do anything about it. And when I finally had the courage, she was gone, and I thought I had lost my chance forever. He paused, and his voice dropped to a whisper. And then you came, and I realized I had not lost her. She left a piece of herself behind. She left you. Hannah looked up at him, her gray eyes, the same gray as his, meeting his across the small distance between them. And she saw, for the first time, not a king, not a stranger, not a man who had kept secrets. She saw a man who had waited 20 years to be forgiven, and who had not known how to ask. You kept her room, she said. You kept her letters. You kept her hair. You kept everything. I kept everything, he said, because everything was all I had. Hannah set the letter down gently and reached out, and she took his hand, the one with the the ring. She turned it over, and she looked at the ring, and she said, You never took it off. No, he said. I never did. She looked at him, and the words came out before she could stop them. I want to stay. Her voice was small, and it shook, and she held his hand tight, as if she were afraid he would disappear. I want to stay, if you will have me. I want to stay, and I want you to teach me about her. I want you to tell me the stories you remember. I want to know who she was before she was my mother. I want to know who she was when she loved you. Nathaniel's breath caught, and he bowed his head, and for a long moment he did not speak. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, and his voice was thick with a feeling he had not let himself name in 20 years. I will tell you everything, he said, every story, every memory, every small, foolish thing I remember about her. I will tell you until you know her as well as I did, and then I will tell you more. He paused, and his voice cracked. I will have you, Hannah. I will have you with all my heart, if you will have an old man who is too afraid to say the things he should have said. Hannah let go of his hand, and she reached up, and she put her small arms around his neck. She held him tight, and she buried her face in his shoulder. And she cried, not the way she had cried when she was alone, but the way she cried when she knew someone was there to hold her. You came, she whispered. When she wrote to you, you came. You kept your promise. He held her, his big arms folding around her small body with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man of his size and his power. He held her, and he pressed his cheek to the top of her head, and he said in a voice that was barely a whisper, I will always keep my promise. I will always come. You will never be alone again." They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling on the cold floor of a room that had waited 20 years to be filled with warmth again. The snow fell beyond the window, and the wind sighed around the tower, and the dried thorn flowers on the sill trembled, as if they too remembered a spring that had once been. Finally, Hannah pulled back and wiped her eyes. She looked at the letters in the chest, and then at the portrait that hung in the corridor beyond the door, and she said, "I want to see the portrait again. I want to look at it now, knowing what I know." Nathaniel rose, and he offered her his hand. She took it, and he helped her to her feet, and they walked together out of the tower room, down the narrow stairs, and into the long corridor where the portrait hung. Hannah stood before it, her mother's face looking down at her, young and bright and full of a life she had not yet lived. The thorn flowers in the portrait identical to the ones on the sill, identical to the ones that grew wild along the edge of the thornwood, and there on Margaret's left cheek, small and faint, a single freckle. Hannah touched her own cheek at the same spot, and she smiled. "She had my freckle," she said. "She did," Nathaniel said. "She used to say it was her favorite thing about her face. She said it was the mark of a person who is not afraid to be seen." Hannah looked up at him. "I am not afraid any more," she said. "Not with you." Nathaniel did not answer with words. He reached out, and he took her hand, and he held it. And together they stood before the portrait of Margaret, the woman they had both loved, the woman who had brought them together, and the silence between them was not heavy. It was warm, and it was safe, and it was the silence of two people who had finally found each other and who were no longer alone. The snow came down soft and steady over the thornwood, and the castle settled into the deep, quiet rhythm of winter. It had been 9 days since Hannah had read the letter hidden behind her mother's portrait. 9 days since she had told Nathaniel that she wanted to stay, and in those 9 days, something had changed in the old stone walls. Something that had nothing to do with the season. Hannah no longer walked the corridors like a guest who was afraid to touch anything. She had learned the way to the kitchen by the smell of baking bread, and the way to the great hall by the echo of her own footsteps, and the way to the stables by the sound of Storm's low, patient wicker. She had stopped counting the candlesticks, because she no longer needed to count anything to feel safe. On the 10th morning, Mistress Eleanor found her in the kitchen, sitting on a low stool by the bread oven, watching the flames dance behind the iron door. The housekeeper said nothing at first. She simply set a small bundle on the table beside Hannah, wrapped in clean linen, and went back to her work. Hannah unfolded the bundle slowly. Inside was a winter cloak, made of thick gray wool, lined with soft rabbit fur, and stitched along the collar with a neat, careful hand. It was not new, but it was well made, and it had been altered to fit a small, thin girl of 11 years. "For me?" Hannah said. Eleanor sniffed, not turning around. "The old one you arrived in would not keep a sparrow warm. Mind your manners, child, but wear it first and argue later." Hannah pulled the cloak around her shoulders. It was warm, and it smelled faintly of lavender, and it felt like the kind of thing a mother might have made. If Mother had been there to make it. She did not say that out loud. She simply sat there, wrapped in the gray wool, and let the warmth sink into her bones. That afternoon, old Bram came up from the stables, stamping the snow from his boots, and found Hannah in the courtyard, feeding bits of dried apple to Storm through the fence. The old white horse crunched the apple contentedly, and the old groom leaned on the rail beside the girl, watching the two of them with a look that was half amusement and half something softer. "Aye, lass, the stones remember everything," he said. "But I think the horses remember more than the stones do." Hannah looked up at him. "Was Storm always here? In the castle, I mean?" Old Bram was quiet for a long moment. He took off his worn leather cap, turned it over in his hands, and put it back on. Then he looked at the old white horse, and he looked at the girl who stood beside it, and he decided that some truths were gentler when they came from an old man who had seen too many winters to be afraid of the past. "No, lass," he said. "Storm was not always here. I brought him to the Thornwood when he was a foal, barely a few weeks old. His dam was a grey mare, a fine, steady creature with a white blaze and a patient eye.
She belonged to a young woman who used to come down to the stables every morning, rain or shine, to brush her down and talk to her about everything and nothing. Hannah's hands had gone very still on the fence rail. A young woman? Aye. Old Bam nodded slowly. She had hair the color of flax and eyes like the winter sky, and a laugh that could make the old stones feel warm. She rode that grey mare along the ridge every summer, and she planted a briar of white thorn by the stable door, and she told me once that the horse was the only creature who never judged her for being who she was. Hannah did not need to ask the young woman's name. She knew it. The way she knew the shape of her own mother's face, the way she knew the soft, worn feel of the old scarf she still kept folded under her pillow. She looked at Storm, at the white coat and the patient dark eye, and she understood. "She was my mother's horse," Hannah said quietly. "Storm is her horse's foal." "Aye," old Bram said. "The Alpha King kept her mare here after the young woman went away. He kept her fed and brushed and turned out in the best pasture, even though she was no use to anyone for riding or work, and when the old mare grew too old and passed in her sleep, he kept her foal. He has kept Storm all these years, lass, not because the horse is useful, and not because it is fine to look at, but because it is all he has left of her. He is a man who does not know how to speak his heart, so he keeps it in the stables, in the pasture, in the things he tends to with his own hands." Hannah reached out and stroked Storm's soft nose. The old white horse leaned into her palm, warm and trusting, and for a moment she thought she could feel something of her mother in that steady, patient presence. She did not cry. She had done enough crying in the past weeks. Instead, she pressed her forehead against Storm's mane, and she breathed in the smell of hay and horse and winter, and she said very softly, "Thank you for keeping her." Old Bram cleared his throat and looked away, because there was something in his eye that he did not want the girl to see. "Aye, well," he said gruffly, "the Alpha King is asking for you. He is in the small hall. I would not keep him waiting, if I were you." Hannah found Nathaniel in the small hall, standing by the tall window, looking out at the falling snow. He was not wearing his usual dark leather and cloak. He had changed into a plain tunic of deep forest green, and he had left his sword in the armory, and he looked, for the first time since she had arrived, like a man who was not preparing for a fight. He turned when she came in, and he looked at her for a long moment, taking in the grey wool cloak and the way she had grown a little more used to the shape of the castle around her. "You have been speaking with old Bram," he said. "He told me about the mare," Hannah said. "About Storm, about my mother, and the stable, and the white thorn by the door." Nathaniel did not deny it. He simply nodded, slowly, and looked back out at the snow. "She loved that horse more than she loved most people," he said. "I think the horse loved her back, in the way that horses do, without questions, without conditions, just there, every morning, waiting for her." Hannah came to stand beside him at the window. They stood together in silence, watching the snow fall on the courtyard, on the stables, on the grey stones of the thornwood. And after a while she said, "Old Bram says you asked for me." "I did." Nathaniel turned to face her, and there was something in his grey eyes that she had not seen there before. It was not the cold guardedness of the first days, and it was not the raw, open grief of the night he had shown her the letter. It was something quieter, steadier, like a door that had finally been unlatched and was waiting for someone to walk through it. "I have lived in this castle for more than 40 years, he said. "I have commanded armies, and I have held this land through drought and war and famine. I have had lords kneel to me, and enemies beg for mercy. But I have never asked anyone to stay. I have ever asked anyone to be part of the Thornwood, not by blood and not by choice. I have been afraid, I think, to want something that could be taken away." He paused, and he reached up and he touched the iron ring on his thumb, the one Margaret had given him so many years ago. "Your mother gave me this ring when she was 16 years old, and she made me promise that I would not let it make me hard. I have not always kept that promise, but I want to try again. I want to ask you not as a lord to a ward, but as a man to a child he has come to care for more than he knows how to say. Will you stay?" Hannah looked up at him, at the scar above his brow, and the gray threading through his dark hair, and the way his hand was trembling just a little around the iron ring. And she thought of her mother's letter, hidden in the iron box in the tower room, the one that said he was the only man she had ever trusted. "Yes," she said, "I will stay, if you will have me." Nathaniel let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a very long time, and then very slowly he lowered himself to one knee in front of her, so that his gray eyes were level with hers, and he took her small hand in his. "Then I, Nathaniel of House Thornwood, Alpha King of this land, do swear, before the stones and the snow, and the memory of your mother, that you shall have a hearth here for as long as I draw breath," he said. "You shall have a roof against the rain, and a fire against the cold, and a place that is yours, not as a guest, but as family. And if ever you need me, I will be there. I will always be there." Hannah's eyes filled with tears, but she did not let them fall. She reached out with her free hand and touched the iron ring on his thumb, and she said, "Your ring is warm." Nathaniel looked out at the
Leaking and then at her, and something in his face softened. "Your mother gave it to me," he said. "It has been warm ever since." That evening, the castle gathered in the great hall for the first time in many weeks. The servants had hung garlands of dried thorn and winter berries along the walls, and the fires were lit high in every hearth, and the long table was set with more food than Hannah had ever seen in one place. Eleanor had made her famous honeyed oat cakes, and old Bram had brought a small bundle of dried apples from the storehouse, and even the kitchen boy had been allowed to come up and sit at the far end of the table because the Alpha King had said that this was a night for family. And family meant everyone who had kept the Thornwood warm through the long years. After the meal, when the plates had been cleared and the wine had been poured and the fire had burned low, Nathaniel rose from his seat and walked to the door of the great hall. He returned a moment later, carrying something large and carefully wrapped in clean linen. Hannah watched as he set it against the wall above the great fireplace and unwrapped it slowly, and when the linen fell away, she saw her mother's portrait. The one that had hung in the corridor, the one she had asked about on that first confused, frightened day. Nathaniel did not say anything. He simply hung the painting above the hearth, where the firelight would fall on it, where it would be seen by everyone who sat at the table, where it would watch over the room like a quiet, gentle presence. And then he stepped back, and he looked at it, and he said, very softly, "She should be here. She should have been here all along." Hannah came to stand beside him, looking up at her mother's painted face, at the flaxen hair and the gray eye
thing and the small, faint freckle on the left cheek. She did not feel sad. She felt for the first time that her mother was not lost, but simply waiting, in the only way she could, for her daughter to find the place where she belonged. "She would have liked the fire," Hannah said. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, low and rough, "She did. She told me once that the Thornwood was the only place she had ever felt warm." Hannah leaned against him, and after a moment he put his hand on her shoulder, gentle and sure. They stood together before the fire, the old Alpha King and the orphaned girl, under the painted eyes of the woman who had brought them together. And the snow fell softly beyond the windows, and the house of Thornwood was no longer a house of silence and secrets. It was a home. And in the stable, the old white horse stamped his foot and settled into the warm hay, and he knew, in the way that horses know such things, that he would not have to wait alone anymore. Some secrets remain frozen for 20 years, waiting only for the one person who can melt them away. Through a long, silent vigil, Nathaniel ultimately found a warm home amidst the snow and wind. Have you too ever steadfastly held fast to a promise over the years? If the story of Hannah and the King touched your heart, please like the video and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments, and we'll see you for the next story.